Good afternoon. Thank you again for the very kind invitation, and again my apologies also on behalf of the partner Ellen van Loon that she cannot be with us today. As announced, I've spent around 3 years of my life on the Venice Biennale, and I'd like to share some thoughts and also some inspirations that I've gained from this project with you today. Can we? Good. First of all, let me explain. I am an associate for AMO. AMO is the counterpart to OMA, and where we focus at AMO particularly at not building buildings, but rather at looking at other fields that influence architecture, such as politics, culture, business, and media. This is what AMO does. It went to China in the early 90s to see this explosion of urbanization as it was happening and try to make sense out of it. And this is OMA's response in a way. The CCTV headquarters building in Beijing, where we were very alerted by the destruction of a lot of specifically modernist heritage in Europe and also abroad, which triggered a fascination with preservation, which then also got this echo in our build work. This is a recently completed building in Milan for the Prada Foundation. And even more recently, the developments in the Middle East, which we all know are now very dramatic, and we also try to make sense of them, and this is OMA's response to that. This is a headquarters building in Qatar, which will be opened later this year. Fundamentals. I think probably most of you here are aware of the idea that there is such a thing as this biennale in Venice. It is one of the most prominent platforms for architectural communication around the world, which happens every 2 years. To briefly explain, for those of you who have not been there yet, the San Marco Piazza San Marco is just outside of the frame of this picture, but there's this huge garden where there is a central exhibition. There are national pavilions. You will find, if you look very closely, the Danish pavilion somewhere here. There is then a secondary location, the Arsenale, where there's an additional presentation directed by Rem Koolhaas and us from AMO. This exhibition, Elements of Architecture, was an exploration of the past and the future of these very practical and mundane types of elements, which are part of any architecture that we all use in every culture, in every time almost. We have had a personal relationship with many of these elements. And what we try to do is actually to enrich the vocabulary of architecture as it is developing now. We felt that a certain freshness, a certain air is perhaps needed to enliven the architectural discourse to some extent. And we set out on this exploration of these very mundane but very interesting pieces which we all are confronted with. And I would like to also put that under the banner of this quote that I found recently from Friedrich Nietzsche, who expresses that it was not done with the explicit intent to come up with a new type of theory, but more to engage with a type of deeper understanding with the fundamentals of architecture. This was our team. Our team consisted of a number of students from Harvard, with whom we worked for about 2.5 years on establishing a body of knowledge, where we give them one assignment, basically, and that comes from a 50s manifesto, to describe all these very practical elements as if you are a Martian, as if you come from a very different planet, and you had to make sense of this type of world in which we live. So these are the different phases that this research project went through. You see kind of the volume changes and the thicknesses, and this is the final product. At the same time that we were developing the book, we were also developing this exhibition. And the exhibition basically consisted of a number of rooms. It is almost an impossible floor plan, this central pavilion, where every room basically had one element as its shining author. This is the opening space where we actually try to give this préambule of the ceiling, as you see. And basically what we here wanted to highlight was that there's increasingly a difference between the ceiling that we see and the space in between the roof and its ceiling. So that basically that from a condition where there was a very thin poché between the roof and the ceiling, you now sometimes have a complete floor occupying this poché, and which is also actually in the hands of a different discipline, namely the engineer, that the architect has hardly any influence on how to design these things. So basically we went also iconographically, we went from this type of architecture and to this type of architecture. And our question basically is what happened in between. We wanted to reconstruct that as the beginning to really create this type of tension that architecture has evolved in many different ways throughout various cultures and through various time frames, which was the secondary objective that we wanted to notify of. I think one of the most exciting parts of the exhibition is something that I cannot show, unfortunately, today, but it consisted of a movie by David Rapp, in which he went through the entire vocabulary of Hollywood and tried to find all the elements as they kind of are portrayed by Hollywood, and sometimes in ways far more effective than any form of architecture could ever probably achieve. You see that all these stills from these famous movies were put one behind the other, and it created a fantastic movie of about 45 minutes, which I would be happy to hopefully share with you one day. For example, everybody knows these toilet scenes or window scenes. So my advice basically to people visiting an exhibition was either you go and sit down and just enjoy this movie, or you can actually wander around and learn about our research project. I think both had the same type of effect which we wanted to achieve. Now about this exhibition, it is partially also homages to people currently unrecognized in the field of architecture, although they have kind of great achievements behind it. This is Friedrich Mielke. He's a professor from Regensburg. He was, I think, 94 years old when we first met him. He's the world's foremost stairologist. He focused his research attention for 40 to 50 years purely on the research on stairs. He had an enormous collection of stairs, and specifically of models of stairs, which was a fantastic type of display, which we were fortunate enough to also bring to Venice. It was a really dazzling experience, and this is his life's work production in books on stairs, about 25 of them, and with staggering amounts of detail. For example, there's one book that specifically focuses on Ingolstadt in Germany, where he tracked every house and where the staircase was made and how and by which carpenter, etc. So it's partially also an homage to these type of unrecognized heroes for us. The second of these heroes is this Englishman. He started collecting window frames when he was 16 years old. He now has a collection of around 50,000 windows spread over some estates in England. And this is what we found basically when we went to his lots. It was really filled with loads and loads of these types of barracks full of windows from every type of era that you can imagine. And we asked him to basically make a highlight out of his collection, which is obviously for him was a dazzling task of which he almost succumbed by. You see him here, Charles Cooking. He was also there to enlighten the people of the complexity of his collection, which really had these fantastic kind of neo-Gothic windows to very modern ones. A secondary group that we also wanted to include in this exhibition was producers. For us, they are also very important because they also partially frame everything that the architect has to work with. We were, in the context of this window, also puzzled by these extremely complex type of window fittings, which almost look like miniature floor plans in themselves. So we also went to many of the factories and we imported one of the factory parts into the exhibition
So where you see in the background this historic collection of windows, in the foreground there's actual window testing going on, because windows need to be obviously very tested in this condition. The corridor is a bit of a special thing because it's not very concrete, it's a spatial element. It basically went from a 19th or an 18th century tradition of a social space to something that, at least in the school where I was taught, is considered just kind of something that you should definitely avoid at all costs. So it's a bit of an
element that got crushed also under increased amounts of codification. This is a diagram showing all the types of codification currently needed to even construct a corridor, or these type of very kind of detailed basically manuals to construct corridors in spaces for demented people with kind of excruciating details, and everybody's been in these type of homes, and I was always puzzled by the fact that they all look so alike. Now I know, because everybody uses the same manual. So I think also the role of the manual in architecture is something that definitely needs to be discussed perhaps a bit further. Then unusual finds in terms of corridors. Briefly, one example. This is an estate, also in England, was conceived by the 5th Duke of Portland, who was also the Sheriff of Nottingham. For people who've read Robin Hood, this is obviously very exciting. He lived in the 19th century, and he is a very puzzling figure because he created an enormous, more than 5 kilometers long corridor network throughout his estate. He did that partially so that he would never be actually seen in real life. He wanted to travel throughout his entire estate without ever being seen. So he asked the people who were also at the same time constructing the London Tube system to build these type of really elaborate labyrinths of endless corridors, which sometimes even kind of coalesce in this type of ballrooms in the middle of nowhere, where you have, in this maze, you have no idea where you are. So you see the power of, if you look at a single element and you take that to extreme levels, you see an architectural experiences which is really unrivaled, in my opinion. The balcony is also an interesting space because it's an interface between outside and inside. It is where public life meets private life, and obviously in many cultures there's been really an extreme diversity in how you address that condition. Here you see two relatively contemporary ones. This is the French balcony, which we all know, and this is the balcony on the Bauhaus, which we reconstructed together with TU Delft. Also, in terms of in contemporary architecture, you can use the balcony in terms of trying to find out if there's actually life in a city. This is a detail from a study that we did in Dubai, which is, as you all know, this extreme newly built collection of skyscrapers, where it's sometimes puzzling to find out actually who inhabits it, and we here in minute detail try to find, according to the balconies, whether there's actually life. The second important aspect of the balcony is obviously that it's also a matter of a political stage, that you can, it used to be a main intermediary between addressing a public and addressing power. The toilet is in that sense also very interesting because it was a social space and it became private. It used to be part of architecture. It got solidified literally in the toilet bowl, although there are still some practices of a more social type of toilet around. And it also reminds us, I think, of the value of architecture on the smallest detail and also on the physical proximities. We found, for example, this book by Alexander Kira, which had an extremely detailed study of how the human system of the daily practices that we all have to go through functions. And this is perhaps in the discourse of architecture also been a bit perhaps well, at least has not received as much attention as it perhaps could have had. Then I spoke that it's history and future of architecture. This is a very small part of the future that I'd like to share with you. I can do a whole second presentation only about future, but let's not get into that. But this is the most advanced toilet that we could find. It's a Japanese toilet. Obviously, they are the front runners in the field of toiletry, which comes with this type of app, which even kind of gives you good types of musical support if you need it, but can also record what you did on the toilet and what type of qualities. And that is a secondary thing that we actually realized increasingly throughout this research project, and specifically looking at the future of architecture, that architecture in the future will not be mute, but will be a communicating device through the intense smartification of architecture, either through windows, through floors, through elevators who know where you want to go, etc. And that in that sense, that will be a dramatic shift, I think, also for the profession. The ramp is a particular element which I dearly connect to, because I was partially also responsible for it in the exhibition. The ramp is an interesting thing. It's one of the most blunt and types of elements that you can imagine, but it also fosters two extreme heroes for me, both on very different levels and on very different interests. On the left, Tim Nugent, on the right, Claude Benoit. I will briefly walk you through their achievements. This is a photo by Tim Nugent. He was a veteran of the Second World War, came back to the US. Many of his fellow students, comrades, had been injured and had been left to the wheelchair, and he noticed that they could not get into schools, and because of the lack of wheelchair ramps, he started to build them. Actually, he also started to test them on the university campus. So that here you see a test ramp where he made very detailed notes on kind of how fast people would take it, what the slope angle should be, and really also tried to get these students and these people to work hard to be able to achieve this. He proposed this type of ideal elevation for the ramp, which through 40 years of his work and mainly of diplomacy and of advocacy, got inserted in many of the code books that we all have to adhere to every day. So whether you're building in India, whether you're building in United Emirates, etc., you always have to abide these codes, and this was a guy who actually made sure that that code exists. Obviously, as architects, we are sometimes also very highly frustrated by his advancement, but you can also see that as a real genuine quality and asset that he has brought to the entire world. And I was thankful enough to be able to still interview him. He's still alive, but it leads to these type of insane type of constructions. But at the same time, it liberated many of the handicapped people in the world. The second person, Claude Benoit, is a French architect who took the ramp, actually, who was born in the same year as Tim Nugent, who took it into a very different direction. He basically had a theory, and I'm now going to condense it to a very minimal, it was quite elaborate, but that the human brain, when you walk on a flat surface, does not produce any energy. Only if you go up, the stress kind of adds to the quality of thinking, and when you go down, also the relaxation has a certain effect on your mentality. So he really hated every flat surface that he found. So he basically advocated for a life like this on ramps basically only, and to show his point, he constructed his own house completely filled with ramps. So this is his living room. He also had a dining room, which was also completely made out of these ramps. And for the exhibition, we reconstructed his living room, and on the other side you see the first wheelchair ramp. Now the roof, as promised, I would speak mostly about this thing. It's very dear to me because it took me 1.5 years to try to get something together that would sort of represent the history and the future of the roof. It is very dear also in terms of the list of elements because it's something that is so necessary and so old that many of the elements that we discussed you can easily do without, but the roof is one that we all share, and also through different types of cultures you see already that, throughout the world there's been an incredible diversity of them for a long time. For a long time also socially and in a city planning perspective, the roof was a crucial component which kind of signaled some form of authority, whether it be like here in a political sense, where you can clearly mark out by the roof what is the centralizing function. It still has this function to this day in certain aspects. A second, so I think why the roof is so important, because it used to be a signifier of certain order, and specifically also if you look at Copenhagen, you see obviously that Danish architecture has a very tight and close relationship to the roof. We've asked to start out with a very basic question, if given this premise of being a Martian, if you would have one of these books, so either Vitruvius or from different cultures, if you would have it and you would not have a clue of what a roof is, does it tell you how to build actually a roof? And actually it was most telling that things like Vitruvius, they talk about roofs, but they never really specify to any form of detail what you actually should do. And we found some other books which actually from other cultures which were actually far more precise on how you should build a roof. The second reason why the roof was so important to us was also finding parts of this drawing. This is a drawing by Hendrik Petrus Berlage, a famous Dutch architect who traveled to Indonesia in the 30s and started drawing a lot of these roofs. And in his diary, he started wondering why can't we encompass these types of roofs, these which are somewhat strange to us, in the Western canon, which triggered me to try to find out, okay, what is this non-Western canon? And we found this book, Yingxia Faxi. It is a 12th century book on Chinese architecture. It's actually the oldest complete treatise on Chinese architecture. It was only rediscovered in the beginning of the 20th century, and only since 30 years is available in a contemporary Chinese translation. So there isn't really a good book, a good translation in English, which was obviously very frustrating because there are books about the book. So what we set out to do is basically we started together with some Chinese colleagues that I have starting to translate the texts that actually discussed the roof particularly. And because actually if you try to actually read the text, then they still make absolutely no sense because it's written in a type of Timberman's language, which is just, for me was impossible to understand. So we had the opportunity to work at the Shenzhen Biennale and to invite Chinese students to help us actually to find out what this construction actually really looked like. And we tried to focus on two parts of this roof. This is a bottom part with a very complex bracket set called Daogum, and the rooftop. Basically, and we set out on this kind of mission to try to reconstruct one of these roofs. And here you see kind of somewhere intermediary the parts that made just for one small knot. So basically this whole table is condensed into this detail of one section of a small roof, which was quite complicated to make. The Chinese were highly precise. If you were a millimeter off, you could basically throw the whole thing out and start all over again, which was quite frustrating at some points. Here you see the construction of the rooftop, which looked a bit like this. Apart from trying to build this roof, we also try to make this for our exhibition a bit visible. Okay, so we have a translation, what actually is being discussed on this page. So we made this kind of sequence explaining on every page how they basically came to constructing this roof. This is the installation in Venice, where we were able to present it. So here, you, for example, you see a detail of it is very precisely described how you cut one of these shapes. It also revealed a very different aspect, which was very exciting for us. That basically this handbook that we found stipulated basically the shape and cost of every public architecture that you would have throughout the entire Chinese empire. So basically the reason why we don't know any architects from China for this period of time, so this book almost kind of was stipulated, nobody was allowed to deviate from this code. So basically there was actually no need for architects because everybody simply had to follow this book. This book also had a kind of a sociological, social theory behind it, basically that your rank in society would also reflect the size of your building, both in terms of how the dimensions, but also in terms of the parts of the roof itself. For example, you see here that this is the size of an element for rulers. They would be able to build at this scale. So you see here, this is a fragment of this part. So basically, if you basically you're layman, you would have a simple size object like this. If you would be an emperor, you would be that size. And that already, as a starting point to start thinking about architecture for us, was really completely exciting. Secondly, it also included things about cost cutting. For example, it already kind of said that, okay, if you have a lot of money, then you can build your detail like this. If you don't have a lot of money, you can simplify it by reducing the amount of elements in the system. Because it was also a time, just like now in China, that the society was growing very rapidly. Also, the economy was growing very rapidly at the same time. There was a lot of corruption, and to curb this corruption, it was a very hardcore calculation on what buildings actually should cost and can cost. So we try to condense that now in a Western mathematical formula, but it was really hardcore to the bone. This is what you can get, and there is no such thing as exceeding construction costs. So this concludes a bit of my story about sort of pitched roofs. I'm not going to hopefully bore you too much with this any further. Second thing I would like to talk about, the second really important roof shape for us was the dome. You see here, everybody knows this dome. Everybody who watches House of Cards or everybody who follows the news, it's become the most recognized architectural object actually around the world. And we try to put that slightly into context. Obviously the American Capitol dome was not the first of its sort. It's actually a mix of 5 European domes that were copied. It was also replaced, it burned down, etc. So you see that this type of architecture is actually part of a family tree, and it's part of a family history basically of domes, and it's a type of genealogy that perhaps in contemporary architecture is not that common anymore, and perhaps interesting to rediscuss. Here you see for the kind of the afterlife. Actually, these are all the state domes in the US, which somehow always reflect and copy the original in Washington. And actually, this is a short overview of recently constructed domes that we found. And perhaps due to the fact that we're all so busy on the zine, etc., and following very nice Nordic minimalist architecture forget to also consider that these things are being constructed around the world and they are great achievements of a lot of craftsmanship, which I hope we can reappreciate perhaps. Then the flat roof. This is another very dramatic story in the history of the roof. Basically, in the 1920s, a war broke out between two types of roof in Germany. On one hand, the flat roof, supported by the modernists, which we all know, and the counter movement, the pitched roof movement, which resided mostly in the south and had a slightly more nostalgic ambition. There were two very interesting articles published really on the same time almost. One by Walter Gropius, which was basically a questionnaire to all modern architects, which he also sent out throughout Europe, questioning the role of the flat roof. And it's very interesting. I can really recommend you to buy our books and actually read the entire detail. I don't have the time to fully go into it, but and it was very refreshing for me that his questions were very concrete. His questions to the architecture profession were, send me the best detail that you can draw of a flat roof. And then a whole kind of correspondence emerges in the next issues of Bauwelt, purely focused on details of roofs. I think a discussion architects perhaps don't have that much at the moment, at least not on that level. There were contributions also from Le Corbusier, from Out, from really a large variety. And the counter movement, actually, if you read this book, and this man has later became one of the chief Nazi architects, so he was also partially discredited, to some extent rightfully, but actually he also has a lot to say in favor of the pitched roof, which actually leaves me undecided which side to really fully support, apart from the fact that obviously Icopal has excellent flat roofs. This is another illustration of this fight between the modernists on the one hand. This is a postcard sketch that Mies van der Rohe did in 1932, where he basically made fun of the Weissenhof-Siedlung and added pitched roofs to it and say, look how stupid it looks. And this is the counter postcard. Basically, they add, like there was this polemic about that the flat roof is an Arab roof and therefore not good for Germany. So they added all these type of Arabs in the scene. Funnily enough, actually, for me, the future of an important part of the future of the roof in the 20th century was emerged actually on this kind of brink of this war zone here. It was in an unexpected place in Jena at the Carl Zeiss factory, where Carl Zeiss, the manufacturer of lenses, built a planetarium, a telescopic lens, and needed architecture to support that, but there was no type of architecture that could work. So he asked an engineer to make this type of, try to make concrete domes, and this is the first try. This is the second evolution of this concrete shell, which is very with extreme thinness presented. This is the first patent for a cylindrical shell roof. So this is actually the birth of the concrete shell roof in 1926. So exactly at this moment that these modernist architects are fighting over pitch versus flat, there's actually a really new revolution happening just under their nose, where in 1931 you see this type of these type of amazingly thin concrete shells to emerge, which would later in the 50s really blossom and produce these type of iconic works which we all know today and which still probably are the most important parts of the 20th century architecture, where like 3 centimeter thick concrete can actually form a structure. Yeah, and obviously we still have part of that legacy behind. This is another detail from the actual exhibition that we made, where we try to find a number of these type of shells being under construction. So about the future, I spent like 2 years on this type of research project, and it left me still puzzled on the future, I have to admit. I'm very sorry about that. I think it's a mix. I think if you compare the roof to other elements, it's actually in an exciting phase, I think, because of the plurality and all the possibilities that we have, I think, in terms of shapes. I think the exhibition and the works that you've all produced shows that brilliantly. This future is a bit undecided for me because, for example, there are still these type of references. This is a copy of the US Capitol dome in the province somewhere in China for a municipal courthouse. You also see the roof returning in very promiscuous ways in these type of ethno-parks. This is one under construction in Russia. And we have obviously this omnipresent worldwide adoration of the roof in terms of that we're all, I think, collectively appreciative of these type of old structures which we somehow cannot say goodbye to, and maybe we should not even do that. One thing that is clear for me is that it is a challenging in terms of energy and in terms of performance, and also in terms of use. I think it's for that. Also, many of the projects that I saw include that you can use the surface as just an additional space. Actually, that was also one of the modernist arguments from 1926. I think, funnily enough, color is also part of it. So this is clearly that the color blue will be important for the roof. Additionally, also the color white is important. This is a white roof movement in New York. Green, obviously, is very important for the future of the roof as well. And even red. This is a project in China where this is an existing building where they are just simply adding this roof, this red rooftop, because it simply looks nicer. Thank you.